There is a particular kind of fear that develops slowly rather than arriving all at once, the fear that comes not from a single dramatic battle, but from the gradual, dawning realization that somewhere out in the darkness beyond your own perimeter, someone is quietly, patiently studying your every routine, waiting for exactly the right moment to strike, and then disappear again before you even know they were there. This was the particular horror that German soldiers stationed behind their own supposedly secure lines slowly came to understand during the Second World War. As a small, unconventional British unit calling itself the Special Air Service began operating in the deserts of North Africa and later across occupied France, proving over and over again that no rear area, however far from the conventional front line, could ever truly be considered safe. The origins of this force lay in the imagination of a young officer named David Sterling, who in the summer of 1941 convinced skeptical senior commanders in North Africa to let him try something that ran directly against the prevailing wisdom of how modern warfare was supposed to work. Rather than massing large formations of infantry and armor to fight the enemy head-on, Sterling proposed dropping tiny groups of highly trained men deep behind German and Italian lines, tasked with destroying aircraft, fuel dumps, and other vital targets through sabotage rather than direct assault, before vanishing back into the vast emptiness of the desert. Early attempts were nearly disastrous. A first parachute drop scattered by high winds, leaving much of the initial force dead, captured, or lost in the desert before they had even reached their targets. It would have been entirely reasonable, at that point, for the entire concept to be quietly abandoned. Instead, Sterling adapted, partnering with the already established long-range desert group, whose deep knowledge of desert navigation and survival allowed his men to be delivered to their targets by vehicle rather than parachute, a change that transformed the unit's fortunes almost overnight. What followed was a campaign of destruction that German airfield garrisons across Libya found genuinely difficult to comprehend, let alone effectively counter. Small teams, sometimes numbering only a handful of men, would infiltrate parked aircraft under cover of darkness, attaching small explosive charges to fuel tanks and engines before slipping away again, often achieving results that seemed wildly disproportionate to the size of the force involved. In a single raid on the airfield at Sidi Hanesh in July 1942, a force of SAS jeeps, mounted with machine guns and driving in tight formation, tore directly across the runway itself under cover of darkness, destroying dozens of aircraft in a matter of minutes through sheer speed, aggression, and audacity, before disappearing back into the desert night long before any organized German counterattack could be mounted. German officers reviewing the aftermath of raids like this one struggled to explain, in official reports intended for their own superiors, exactly how such a small force had managed to inflict such disproportionate damage and then simply vanish, seemingly evaporating into terrain that German forces themselves found nearly impossible to navigate or patrol effectively. The psychological effect of these repeated losses spread quickly through German garrison units stationed across the north, African rear areas, transforming what had once felt like relatively safe postings into positions of constant, low-grade anxiety. Soldiers responsible for guarding aircraft, fuel depots, and supply dumps found themselves increasingly unable to trust the quiet of an ordinary night, aware that the very stillness they might once have found reassuring could just as easily conceal a small team of men already moving silently through the darkness toward their position. A German airfield defense officer, describing the aftermath of one such raid in a report later recovered by Allied intelligence, admitted with evident frustration that his men had begun treating every unexplained sound during their night watches as a potential threat, an exhausting, unsustainable state of vigilance that itself began to degrade morale and effectiveness, even on nights when no raid actually occurred. This particular quality, an enemy who might be anywhere, watching from a position you could not identify, waiting for a moment of your own carelessness rather than attacking through conventional force, represented something genuinely new and deeply unsettling within the context of desert warfare as German commanders had previously understood it. Traditional military thinking assumed reasonably clear boundaries between frontline combat zones and secure rear areas, a distinction that allowed rear echelon troops to operate with a degree of relaxed vigilance appropriate to their actual, if implicit, level of risk. The SAS deliberately and repeatedly shattered that assumption, demonstrating that the entire depth of German-occupied territory, not merely the visible front line, now had to be considered potentially contested ground. This forced a widespread and costly reallocation of German resources toward rear area security, diverting troops, vehicles, and attention away from the conventional fighting front, purely to guard against a threat that, by its very nature, could strike almost anywhere and rarely gave any meaningful warning before it did. As the war progressed into 1944, and the SAS extended its operations into occupied France in the weeks and months following the Normandy landings, this same unsettling dynamic reasserted itself in an entirely new theater, disrupting German rear area security at precisely the moment it was most critical to the wider defense of the region. Small SAS teams, often working closely with local French resistance fighters who provided crucial local knowledge and support, were parachuted into rural areas well behind German lines, tasked with harassing supply columns, cutting communication lines, calling in airstrikes against identified targets, and generally sowing exactly the kind of chaos and uncertainty that made it extraordinarily difficult for German commanders to move reinforcements and supplies toward the Normandy front with any confidence of doing so safely. German convoy commanders operating through areas where SAS teams were active described a persistent, gnawing uncertainty that shaped every decision about route selection, timing, and security precautions, an uncertainty that itself imposed significant delays and costs, even on convoys that were never actually attacked. One German transport officer, whose column had suffered a devastating ambush along a rural road in central France, later described the specific horror of an attack that came without any preceding indication whatsoever, vehicles at the front and rear of his column suddenly erupting into flame from concentrated machine gun fire delivered from concealed positions along the roadside. An ambush executed with such precision and speed that his surviving men had almost no opportunity to identify, let alone effectively return fire against, an enemy that had already begun withdrawing back into the surrounding countryside within minutes of the attack beginning. The sheer unpredictability of where and when these attacks might occur forced German forces into an uncomfortable and resource-intensive pattern of behavior, treating every rural crossroads, every stretch of wooded road, every isolated farmhouse as a potential threat requiring caution, and, increasingly, dedicated security patrols that further stretched already overcommitted manpower. Intelligence officers attempting to track and counter SAS activity in occupied France found themselves facing an adversary whose small numbers and close cooperation with local resistance networks made conventional counterinsurgency methods frustratingly ineffective, since destroying or capturing one small team did nothing to address the dozens of other similarly sized groups operating simultaneously across different parts of the country, each one capable of inflicting significant disruption entirely independent of what was happening elsewhere. This pattern of pervasive, difficult-to-counter disruption ultimately provoked a response from the highest levels of German command that speaks volumes about just how seriously this threat had come to be regarded. Hitler's infamous commando order, already discussed extensively in relation to conventional commando raiding forces, applied with equal and often even more brutal force to captured SAS personnel explicitly directing that they be executed rather than treated as legitimate prisoners of war, a policy that led directly to numerous documented atrocities against captured SAS soldiers throughout the French campaign, actions that stand today as clear war crimes and were treated as such in post-war tribunals. That such an extraordinary, legally indefensible policy was specifically extended to cover this particular type of soldier reflects, in its own dark way, an unmistakable acknowledgement from the very top of the German military and political hierarchy that conventional methods of dealing with this threat had simply proven inadequate, and that only the abandonment of established rules of warfare seemed to offer any hope of deterring or eliminating it. Individual accounts from German soldiers who survived encounters with SAS teams during this period consistently describe a particular quality of dread that distinguished these encounters from more conventional combat experiences elsewhere on the front. A German NCO, reflecting years later on his experience defending a rural supply depot that had come under repeated harassment from a nearby SAS and resistance operation, described the specific psychological toll of never quite knowing whether a given night watch would pass uneventfully or end in sudden, violent chaos, a state of prolonged uncertainty that he found, in retrospect, considerably more exhausting and corrosive to morale than the more conventional, if more immediately dangerous, experience of sustained combat on an actual battlefront, where at least the general shape and timing of danger felt somewhat more predictable. The cumulative effect of this sustained campaign of disruption, stretching from the deserts of North Africa through the rural roads and hedgerows of occupied France, extended well beyond the direct physical damage inflicted through destroyed aircraft, ambushed convoys, and severed communication lines, significant though that damage certainly was in its own right. It fundamentally altered how German forces had to think about security across their entire occupied territory, forcing a persistent, resource-draining vigilance that diverted attention, manpower, and psychological energy away from the conventional fighting fronts where those resources were desperately needed. German soldiers who found themselves posted to what should have been quiet, low-risk rear area duties instead discovered that the war had, in a very real sense, followed them there too, carried by small teams of men who understood, with chilling clarity, that the most effective way to defeat a much larger enemy was never to fight it directly where it was strongest, but to strike relentlessly at the places it least expected to be found vulnerable, then disappear back into the darkness before any effective response could ever be organized. It is worth pausing to understand exactly what made these raiding jeeps such an effective tool of psychological warfare beyond their obvious destructive capability. Modified specifically for desert raiding, these vehicles carried multiple mounted machine guns, sometimes twin or even quadruple arrangements, stripped of unnecessary weight, and crewed by men trained to move and fight as a tightly coordinated unit, even at high speed across broken terrain in complete darkness. A German garrison suddenly finding itself under attack from several such vehicles simultaneously, guns blazing as they tore across an airfield or supply area, often had no realistic way of accurately judging the size of the attacking force in the chaos and confusion of the moment. A misjudgment that, much as with the earlier commando raids along the French coast, contributed enormously to the sense of an overwhelming, almost unstoppable assault descending from nowhere. Several German survivors of these raids, when questioned afterward, significantly overestimated the size of the force that had struck them, a natural consequence of facing concentrated, aggressive firepower delivered with total surprise, but one that nonetheless fed directly into the growing mythology surrounding this unit's capabilities. The relationship between the SAS and the long-range desert group deserves particular attention as well, because it illustrates just how much of this success depended on capabilities that had almost nothing to do with combat prowess in the conventional sense. Long-range desert group patrols possessed an intimate, almost encyclopedic knowledge of the deep desert, understanding water sources, terrain features, and navigation techniques that allowed them to guide raiding parties across seemingly impassable stretches of open desert that German and Italian forces considered entirely impractical for organized movement. This meant that SAS raiding parties could approach targets from directions their defenders had never seriously considered needed protecting, striking from what amounted, in practical terms, to the least defended possible angle, precisely because no reasonable military planner had imagined an attacking force could realistically arrive that way. German intelligence officers, attempting retrospectively to understand how their supposedly secure rear airfields kept suffering these devastating losses, gradually came to appreciate that conventional assumptions about defensible terrain simply did not apply to an enemy willing and able to cross hundreds of miles of what most soldiers considered genuinely uninhabitable desert purely to achieve the advantage of surprise. Survivors among the raiding parties themselves, in post-war memoirs and interviews, described the extraordinary discipline required to sustain these operations over such vast distances and such extended periods away from any conventional support or resupply. Water, fuel, and ammunition all had to be calculated with obsessive precision, since any serious miscalculation in the deep desert could prove just as lethal as enemy action, arguably more so given the complete absence of any prospect of rescue or medical evacuation hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly position. This meant that the men selected for these operations required not simply combat skill and physical toughness, though both were certainly demanded in abundance, but also a particular temperament suited to sustained, disciplined operation under conditions of genuine isolation and constant low-level risk, qualities that training and selection processes specifically sought to identify and cultivate from the earliest stages of recruitment into the unit. The transition of these techniques and this underlying philosophy into the very different terrain and conditions of occupied France in 1944 required considerable adaptation. Yet the fundamental principles that had proven so effective in the desert translated remarkably well into the new environment. Where the long-range desert group had once provided intimate local knowledge of terrain and navigation, French resistance networks now filled a broadly similar role, offering detailed knowledge of local roads, German troop dispositions, and safe houses that allowed SAS teams to operate effectively despite parachuting into entirely unfamiliar territory. This partnership proved mutually valuable, resistance fighters gaining access to trained military personnel, specialized weapons, and direct radio links to Allied command capable of calling in air support, while SAS teams gained the local knowledge and support network necessary to operate and survive in hostile, occupied territory for extended periods. German counterintelligence efforts throughout this period reveal just how seriously this combined threat was ultimately taken, with substantial resources devoted to infiltrating resistance networks, tracking radio transmissions, and attempting to identify and eliminate SAS teams operating within occupied France. These efforts occasionally succeeded, and the war saw genuinely tragic losses among both SAS personnel and the French civilians who supported them. Losses that included documented executions carried out in direct violation of established laws of war under the authority of Hitler's commando order. Yet even these determined counterintelligence efforts never came close to eliminating the threat entirely, since the fundamental structural advantage held by small, dispersed, locally supported teams operating across a wide and only thinly controlled rural landscape meant that German forces were perpetually reacting to a threat whose next appearance they could rarely predict with any real confidence. There is a particular category of German testimony from this period that deserves special mention, drawn from soldiers who survived encounters not through combat success, but through simple chance, positioned just far enough from an ambush point or a sabotaged supply line to escape its worst effects while witnessing the aftermath directly. These accounts often carry a distinctive tone, less focused on describing combat itself and more concerned with conveying the sheer, unsettling randomness of survival under these conditions, a recognition that safety in these rear areas had become, in a very real and immediate sense, a matter of simple luck rather than any meaningful function of rank, caution, or defensive preparation. A German supply officer who survived an ambush that killed several colleagues traveling in a vehicle only slightly ahead of his own described spending the remainder of his posting in France convinced, with what he himself recognized was probably an irrational but nonetheless persistent certainty, that his own survival represented nothing more than an accident of timing that could easily have gone the other way. By the war's final months, the reputation the SAS had built through these years of sustained, unconventional operations had firmly established itself within German military consciousness as something categorically different from ordinary combat risk, a persistent, almost intangible threat that no amount of conventional defensive preparation seemed fully capable of neutralizing. It represented, in its own quiet and largely unheralded way, one of the most psychologically effective demonstrations of the entire war of just how disproportionately a small, superbly trained, and audaciously led force could reshape the strategic calculations of an enemy many times its size, forcing that enemy, ultimately, to abandon even its own claimed standards of legal conduct in a desperate, ultimately unsuccessful attempt to make the fear finally stop. What lingers most powerfully across this entire body of testimony, spanning the deserts of Libya and the quiet lanes of rural France, is not any single dramatic raid or any single decisive engagement, but the accumulated weight of countless smaller moments, a sentry unable to trust the silence of his own watch, a convoy commander recalculating his route for the third time that week, a supply officer haunted by an ambush he narrowly survived purely through chance. These are not the stories that typically dominate popular retellings of the war, which tend to favor dramatic set-piece battles and sweeping strategic narratives. Yet they represent, arguably, the truest and most enduring legacy of what a small force of determined, superbly trained soldiers managed to achieve, proving that the deepest and most lasting damage inflicted upon an enemy is not always measured in destroyed equipment or enemy casualties, but in the quiet, corrosive, permanent erosion of the simple belief that anywhere, ever again, could truly be considered safe.